Greetings, everyone. So I'm going to record a narrative for this PowerPoint. When I presented it back on the 22nd of October, I think I forgot to share my screen, and so it was only audio without the presentation. So here we go. This is a lecture talking about food webs and then effects of biodiversity in the ecosystem as well. So we talked a little bit about trophic cascades and HSS fretwell trophic theory, and we looked at the paper by Mary Power on the Eel River, where she showed that essentially removing the top trophic level from a food web caused the reaction that would be predicted by HSS fretwell trophic theory. But it's certainly a simplified food web. Well, Schmidt-Araya, in a paper from 2002, looked at a fairly small stream, just a couple meters across. Kind of reminds me of Bent Creek, or heck, even Glens Creek for that matter. But they took a detailed look at the food web with the invertebrate component of the food web, and essentially looked at the diet of every invertebrate there in the stream to see how species were connected. Quite a simple food web. There it is. There it is. Not much to it, right? More than a little bit tongue-in-cheek. And so it moves from the energy sources at the bottom up to the top predators at the top. And there's really two approaches to come at it. The first thing is we could look at how species are linked, and then we could look at how energy moves through the system. So one of the first things that they did was they broke the species into their ecosystem roles in the food web. So the dark shapes there are what we would think of as macrofauna. So invertebrates that we could see with the naked eye, take them back to the lab, identify them. But there was a whole lot of myofauna. Remember, these are those tiny consumers that are important in moving energy from biofilms in the microbial loop to the rest of the food web. And then at the very bottom are basal energy sources. And there are a couple energy sources. So we had algae and plant material to the left. So that would be our autochthonous production. Then FPOM to the right of that. Bacteria, that's the microbial loop right there. And then CPOM as well to the right is important. Just to show you what a couple of these consumers look like, up higher up in the food web on essentially the second trophic level, we had a couple of different varieties of helgramites. These were the top predators. A couple other things, some crane flies, which we saw with our invertebrate samples. They were in there eating the CPOM as we might expect. Some stoneflies as well in there. This particular stonefly getting a little bit of plant biomass as well as some CPOM. But then the myofauna was extremely diverse, right? So these are these tiny little consumers. So things like the tardigrades, the water bears, those are two of the consumers that were linked here. It's just incredible to think about the work that goes into this kind of a study to identify not only who is eating the water bears, but what are the water bears eating, right? It's crazy. So they drew a couple conclusions from this in-depth analysis of the stream food web. The first was that intermediate species dominated in number and abundance. And, this is kind of as we might expect, right? That we would have fewer species at the top of the food web than in the middle. The other part was the importance of myofauna, that just looking at the number of species in the stream, it was really dominated by the myofauna, about 70%. But then the third was, we talked about the microbial loop, was that really this food web could be sort of visualized as two sub-food webs, if you like. So the myofauna are connected to other myofauna, whereas the macroinvertebrates are over here on this other side. So again, we're only really familiar with the macrofauna, the macroinvertebrates, but there are a whole lot of smaller species that are really important in moving energy from the bottom of the food web on up. A further conclusion that they drew from this was the importance of the brown food web. And so you might have guessed that from the picture of the stream, right, that this is a headwater stream, probably be a place where allochthonous input is really important. And we can piece that together if we just look at the number of lines radiating out from FPOM and CPOM, right? Lots of species relying on those. Algae and plant material, not much at all. So really, autochthonous production is not real important to the food web here, which is interesting. So if we compare this food web to the simplified food web from the Eel River in California, and we ask ourselves, how might a food web like this differ in its response to adding or losing species compared to that of the Eel River food web that Power studied? And because we have so many species that are interlinked with one another, the impact of losing a species or gaining a species are likely to be lessened because there are lots of other interconnections to mediate the impacts. So for instance, if we lose one of our species of myofauna, it's likely not to have much of an effect because there are other myofaunal species feeding on the same things. And so there won't be any reduced grazing pressure on, say, the FPOM, because there are other myofauna that will go ahead and consume them. As opposed to a more simplified food web with fewer species, you're likely to have a big impact because when one species goes away, there's not another one to take its place. But again, we said there's a couple ways we can look at food webs. One is from a species by species perspective. The other is what this question is getting at, because all connections are created equal in this particular food web, but that might not always be the case. This is a study done looking at filter feeding caddisfly larvae. They're mostly filter feeders. And the authors examined energy flow in this food web. And what they found was that lots of these caddisflies were doing the same thing. That is, they were building nets and filter feeding. However, some of those energy connections were 500 times as strong as others. So you see the dark arrow with the sort of dotted body to it. That shows a lot of energy moving. For instance, from detritus to Ephemeroptera and chironomids, and then a little energy moving from them to the predatory Ocetus caddisfly. Some of these other filter feeding caddisflies, not moving nearly as much energy. So the point here is that just because we have a lot of species in our food web, we need to think about the amount of energy moving through each of those links, not just how many species are connected. Because you could have many species that are connected, but they don't move a whole lot of energy. So the main point then is that some energy pathways are going to be more important than others, and it'll be important to understand that to really get a grasp on how food webs function. And so, yeah, as the authors conclude, right, there needs to be a measure of linkage strength when evaluating these food webs. And so simply measuring connectivity may not be all that useful. And this begs the question, like, where do you draw the boundaries of the food web? And so at this point, we've already watched the film River Webs, which talks about this incredible research originally started by Nakano, but then followed along, further extended by Colin Baxter. And what this work showed is that the terrestrial riparian ecosystem is reliant on the energy moving from the stream to the forest for the lives of spiders and bats and birds. Similarly, the fish in the stream are reliant on the energy moving into the stream from the riparian zone with insects. And so what happened when you cut off the supply of insects from the terrestrial realm was that the fish switched the way that they fed. And when they switched the way that they fed, it brought them into competition with other species. So in fact, there are no real boundaries between food webs in this way. We can think of the Earth as sort of one giant food web. There's been research in North America showing a similar thing. Mary Power and some folks in her lab did research similarly excluding aquatic insects in the riparian zone, and showed that it had a strong effect on terrestrial lizards. So the things are all connected, and where we draw the boundaries in food webs is somewhat arbitrary. All right, so let's think a little bit about how species affect these ecosystem functions. This is a really important topic in ecology in general, and it's tied to the question of conservation biology, because we ask the question, what does it mean to lose a species? Well, if we can tie the number of species to the way an ecosystem functions, then we might be able to understand the way that ecosystem will function differently when we start to lose species. So there's a few alternative hypotheses here. The first is a null hypothesis, and that is simply that ecosystem function is unaffected by the number of species. As we move up and down on our x-axis of species richness, the value on our y is unchanging. The rivet hypothesis is certainly a positive relationship, but you'll notice there are different breaks in that line. The idea here is that losing some species has an effect, but losing others does not. So if we imagine starting on the right side of this x-axis and moving to the left, losses of certain species cause our slope to drop more drastically. So the idea is that some species have greater effects than others, although in reality, all species affect the way an ecosystem works. And we could think of that y-axis being something like primary productivity, right? Rate of leaf decomposition in a stream. It could be anything like that. The redundancy hypothesis. This is the idea that we have certain species doing the same thing in an ecosystem. So we can lose some of those species, but if there are other species doing the same thing, our measure of ecosystem function will be unaffected. But then we get to a point where we don't have any multiple species left doing the same thing in an ecosystem, and then when we lose a species, there's associated loss of ecosystem function. So redundancy basically says, like, yeah, first you can lose a few species and not affect the ecosystem, but eventually it will. And then the idiosyncratic response, which simply says that, yes, there's a relationship, it changes, but it's unpredictable. As we gain and lose species, it's really hard to predict how ecosystems will respond. And so these authors looked at effects of leaf litter decomposition based on diversity of shredding invertebrate communities. And so shredder richness, or number of shredding species on the x, litter decomposition rate on the y. And overall, a positive relationship, right? So the more species of shredders we have in a stream, the faster litter will decompose. But then they looked at the fact that certain species seem to be a little more important than others. So in communities that were dominated by certain species, we saw something that looked a little bit like our earlier relationship, like that redundancy, right? So if we have a place where a certain species dominates, we might lose species that are not that one species. But the real take home here, we might lose species that don't have much of an effect. And we have to lose richness to a great extent before we really see a drop. They also noted this idea of complementarity, and that is that the effect of multiple species is greater than the sum of the individual species themselves. So these authors looked at rates of leaf mass loss on the y again, number of species, and the black dots are what you would expect if you just added up the effects of each species. Whereas the white circles are what they actually observed. So when you put two species together, and they kept the abundance of individuals constant, right? So when you had two species together, the decomposition rates were greater than twice the rate of either species, if that makes sense. So they noted complementarity, which suggests that species are affecting the ecosystem in unique ways, at least in this particular case. So let's think about this idea of species redundancy and what that might mean to the niche diversification hypothesis, right? This idea that in order for species to persist, they have to develop different niches and use resources in different ways. Species redundancy says that species may not be completely unique, right? There may be quite a bit of overlap. So we can ask the question, where would we expect to find the potential for that kind of redundancy? And really the short answer to that is we'd expect to find that wherever there were lots and lots of species. So for instance, the tropics, the Amazon River Basin, incredibly high fish species diversity, a lot higher than North America. So that might be a place where we would expect to find potential for redundancy. So this is a study done in the Orinoco River Basin, looking at the ecosystem effects of fish in the genus Procholotus. Now these are very common food fishes, and they're benthic detritivores, which means they're feeding on the bottom, and they feed on detritus, organic matter on the bottom of the stream. So they're stirring the stream up. So you might ask what effect it has on the ecosystem. And they quantified the flux of carbon downstream in multiple years relative to the amount of biomass in that particular year. And in fact, there was a positive relationship. So when you have more of these species rooting around on the bottom feeding, there's more carbon moving downstream. And this was interesting because this is a highly variable part of the world as far as seasonality goes, right? They have this wet season where the river gets so high, but the biomass of these fish also played a great role. And that was not related, so this organic carbon flux was not related to discharge variation or biomass of other species. So kind of interesting. So these authors said, all right, let's go ahead and let's remove Procholotus from one side of the stream and see how it affects it. And so they did this. They went ahead and they split the stream in half. They buried a fence down the middle of the stream, and what you can see on the bottom is what the bottom of that stream looked like when the Procholotus were removed on the right versus when they were present to the left. And you can see a lot more of organic matter settling on the bottom, right? There's just a lot more detritus on the bottom of the stream to the right. And so essentially what this showed was that carbon dynamics in the stream were greatly affected when Procholotus were absent. So we could look at carbon turnover length, that is how long it takes for carbon to be taken up, processed, and remineralized. And you can see that in the exclusion, that length was a lot shorter, right? On the other hand, metabolism of the ecosystem was higher in the control when Procholotus were there. So the ecosystem was processing carbon faster, significantly faster when these fish were present. They looked at productivity as well, and there's a little different story. Productivity was actually higher when they were excluded. That might be because there was carbon suspended up into the water. But the ratio of photosynthesis to respiration was higher when the fish were there. So there was, relatively speaking, more photosynthesis when the fish were around. Anyway, lots going on, but the bottom line is these fish significantly affected the ecosystem. So what's interesting then is that even in hyper-diverse communities with lots of species, we can find this lack of functional redundancy. That is, one species can have a huge effect. So even though this is a very diverse community, removing Procholotus is going to affect that ecosystem to a great extent. So this led to the question of, when studies find evidence for decreases in species diversity leading to decreases in ecosystem function, is that simply due to a sampling effect? That is, maybe there's only one species that really matters, but you're more likely to get that species in a treatment that has 5 species than 3 than 1. So that's kind of an interesting question to think about. So really, the point is, as these food webs become more and more complex, in many cases, the importance of individual species and individual links drops. those effects are dampened. However, we do have some species, you can call them keystone species, you can call them ecosystem engineers, whatever you want. We do, however, often have species like Procholotus that play a very strong role in the ecosystem and that can really play a role in driving ecosystem processes to a great extent.